By the end of this video, you'll know the answers to 10 frequently asked questions that I often get from Fusion 360 beginners. This tutorial is going to be a little bit different than my normal tutorials. Instead of building something step by step, I'm going to spend some time to answer the top 10 questions that I get asked by Fusion 360 beginners. For your convenience, I've also spelled out all of these questions and their answers in an article that's on my website. To check it out, go to productdesignonline.com/4. That's productdesignonline.com/4, and that URL will automatically redirect to the page with the written explanation and some additional resources. Before we get started, I should also point out that these 10 questions and their answers are not in any specific order. I simply put a number to them so they're easier to reference. Question number 1 is what happened to my components? Why did they all turn disabled? Why are they grayed out? Or why is the opacity lowered? Whether you've been using Fusion 360 for a day or for a year, hopefully you're familiar with the concept of components. To summarize, you can think of components as reusable parts or something that would exist in the real world. To learn more about the components, you can click that link in the upper right-hand corner to watch a video on the difference between components and bodies. Now, to answer these popular questions, you'll notice that when you're working with design files, you'll need to activate one component in order to work on it. Then, all of the other components will automatically have a lower opacity. Watch what happens as I select the Activate Component button in this assembly file. All of these other components that aren't active will appear to be disabled. This is done by default, and it's intended to simply make it easier for you to focus on the component that you have active, since that is, in fact, the component that you're supposed to be working on. If you activate the top level component, you'll see that all the components within your assembly will appear to be active, or they won't have any transparency. This seems to catch a lot of people off guard since other CAD programs don't really do this. But this was implemented because Fusion 360's top-down nature, where you can build all of your parts as components directly within your assembly file. With that said, if you want to turn this option off, then you can do so by changing your preferences. Click on your username in the upper right-hand corner and select the Preference option from the drop-down list. This will open up your Preferences dialog box. From here, you'll have to select the Design tab on the left-hand side. Then, to turn this feature off, you'll simply need to uncheck the Activate Component Visibility option, which is at the very top of the list. Of course, if you do uncheck this option, you'll have to hit the Apply button, and you'll also have to restart Fusion 360 in order for the changes to take effect. Frequently asked question number 2 is why does my model have weird parting lines on the sides? Or why is there a line on my model if my body is solid? To answer this question, we'll have to take a look at the visual style settings. Now, the visual style settings can be found by heading down to the display settings folder at the bottom of your Fusion 360. Select the display settings icon, which is the computer or monitor icon. Then, you'll see the visual style settings all the way at the top of the list. If I hover my mouse over the visual style flyout folder, you'll see there are 6 different options. I believe by default the option is set to shaded with visible edges only. This is actually the setting that I use when I record my tutorials unless I specify otherwise. You'll see when you have the shaded with visible edges only option checked that it will shade your model to make it look a bit more realistic, and it will also add some contour lines on the sides. To clarify, these contour lines are simply a visual setting. They do not affect your model at all. So if you look at this parting or contour line on this model here, this is not something that will be printed out or shown if I export the model and I plug it into another program. The lines are simply there to help you better understand the geometry of your model. If you don't want any lines on your model at all, then you can select the shaded option. If I select the shaded option, you'll notice the contour lines went away. Of course, you can also select the hidden lines option to see all of the hidden contour lines of your model, or the lines that aren't on the outside of your model. I'll also put some more details on my webpage explaining each of these options. Question number 3 that I get asked is, why do my tangency reference lines not show up as they do in your tutorials? Specifically, the Lego tutorial or the first day of the 30-day series, a lot of people have mentioned that they can't draw the circles on the bottom by snapping them tangent to the circles on the top. Unfortunately, there is a setting in your preferences that used to be included in the default settings, which is what I use to record all of my tutorials. Now, for some reason, the Fusion 360 engineers recently decided to not include this feature as one of the default settings. And to be honest, I really don't know why, as it's a very helpful feature. To turn this feature back on, you'll want to click your username in the upper right-hand corner, and then once again select the Preferences menu. Then, once again, we'll select the Design tab on the left-hand side. In the Design menu, you'll want to check the Auto Project Edges on Reference setting. You'll once again have to hit the Apply button, and you'll also have to restart your Fusion 360 in order to get this setting to take effect. I should also point out that because the default settings do change on occasion, I've put together a page on my website to document these important settings, such as this one. I'll put a link down below in the video description to the page, and I'll also include a link on the resource page for this tutorial. Question number 4 that I get asked quite often is whether or not Fusion 360 requires the internet. The true answer to this question is yes. However, you can go in offline mode for up to 2 weeks at a time. Now, this is probably one of the most debated subjects of Fusion 360, but the reality is that Autodesk is pushing to have everything in the cloud. Fusion 360 is a cloud-based product, which requires you to connect to the internet since the storage system where all of your files are located is cloud-based, as well as many of the other core features. Now, the folks at Autodesk often refer those who don't want to use the cloud to use their other product, Autodesk Inventor, which I think makes it pretty clear that they have no intention of changing the cloud-based aspect, at least anytime soon. With that said, let's take a look at how you can work offline and some important things to know about the offline mode. If you click the clock icon in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see your job status, which includes a toggle for working online or working offline. There are 4 main reasons you'll be in offline mode. First, because of service maintenance. There are occasionally maintenance updates that are scheduled, and you should be notified in advance. Second would be an unexpected outage, as in something on the Autodesk end of things is not working, so you'll be placed in the offline mode automatically. The third possibility would be if you have no internet connection. So if you happen to open up Fusion 360 while not being connected to the internet, it will then warn you that you're going to work in offline mode. Lastly, you'll be in the offline mode anytime you toggle the switch if you want to intentionally go into the offline mode. I'll go ahead and select this toggle to switch it to working offline. Now, you're probably wondering, how can you access your cloud-based files if you're not connected to the cloud? Now, this is where the cache comes in. If you look in your preferences, you'll notice a cache setting. I'm going to select my username in the upper right-hand corner. I'll select the Preferences menu, and then you'll want to look at the third option on the list. You'll see you can set this period by a number of days that will be cached. So if mine is set to 15 days, then the last 15 days worth of files and changes will be cached to my local machine. I'm going to close the preferences dialog for now. Since I just entered the offline mode, I'll open up the data panel to look at my recent files. You'll see that many of my recent files appear to be normal, as there's a cached copy of the file on my local machine. However, if I keep scrolling down, you'll see that the files start to get grayed out because the files aren't accessible, as those are files that haven't been cached. Which means if I'm in offline mode, I won't be able to access them. I'll switch back to the online mode and then I'll head to one of the files that weren't previously cached. Now, if you're ever planning on working offline, then you can ensure that certain files are cached by right-clicking on them and selecting the Add to Offline Cache option. You can also export your design files, which leads me to frequently asked question number 5, which is how do I save my files locally? Now, you won't be able to save your files locally in a similar manner as other programs that you're probably used to. Again, this is because of the cloud-based approach that Autodesk is pushing with Fusion 360. However, you can still export your files into a number of popular formats, and you'll have to select where they're saved to on your local machine. To export your files, simply click the File menu, then select the Export option. You'll then see in the Export dialog box that there are a number of file types that you can export as. I'm not going to cover each and every export type for the sake of time. However, I just want to point out the first one on the list, which is the Fusion 360 archive file, or the extension .f3d. Now, this file type is Fusion 360's native file format, which is the same format that the cached files will be on your local machine. Therefore, I always recommend exporting as this format if you're exporting for the sake of having backups or local files on your machine, with the intention of only using them in Fusion 360. Obviously, if you're planning on using the file with another piece of software, then you may want to choose another file type that is better suited for your needs. To reopen a file, you can simply go to the File menu and select the Open option from the list. Then select the file from your local machine. Alternatively, you can upload the file to your data panel directly to the folder that you would like to place it in. Simply open the folder you want the file to be placed in, and then select the blue Upload button. For number 6 of the frequently asked questions is how do I preview new features, or why does my UI look different than others? Once again, I'll select my username in the upper right-hand corner, and then I'll select the preference option from the drop-down list. Then I'll have to select the Preview tab on the left-hand side. You'll see in this preview section that you can turn on different functionality that is essentially in beta testing. For example, many of you have seen or tried out the UI preview, which is the newer user interface that they're looking to implement. You may have even seen this user interface design in some of the Autodesk tutorials. It is important to note that these preview functionalities are not fully pushed out yet, and oftentimes for good reasons, so use them with caution. They often have bugs or may even cause your Fusion 360 to crash or lose other functionalities. Lastly, as always, you'll have to apply the settings and restart your Fusion 360 in order to get the preview functionalities to actually show up. The 7th frequently asked question is how do I get into the Sculpt environment? Or how do I get back into the Sculpt environment? I'll agree that it can be a little confusing when you're working in the Sculpt environment, and you want to switch back and forth between the model workspace. Now, most users think that the Sculpt environment should be available in the workspace's drop-down list. However, you can think of the Sculpt environment as an extension of the model workspace, which is why I try to refer to it as an environment and not a workspace. If you're ever wanting to get back into the Sculpt environment, then you'll simply need to double click on the sculpted form in your timeline at the bottom. This will open up the Sculpt environment and you'll be able to continue to use the sculpting T-spline tools. It's also important to note that you'll have a separate Sculpt environment for each individual sculpted piece that you create. If you have multiple Sculpt icons in your timeline, then you'll want to make sure that you select the correct one before you go to edit the sculpted body. Otherwise, the other sculpted bodies will appear grayed out as only the bodies in the active Sculpt environment will be accessible. Question number 8 is in regards to converting STL or mesh files to BREP solid bodies. I often get asked what is the maximum number of faces that I can convert. For those of you that use Fusion 360 for 3D printing purposes, you've probably at some point found yourself wanting to convert a Thingiverse file to a solid body so you can customize or alter it. Oftentimes, the conversion won't work in Fusion 360, and it will give you an error that there are too many faces or triangles. Now, the general rule of thumb is that the file can't have more than 50,000 triangles or faces. Otherwise, Fusion 360 simply can't process it. With that said, I recommend shooting for 30,000 faces or lower, as you'll get much better results and the chances of Fusion 360 crashing on you will be significantly lower. I'll also link to the video where I go further in depth into converting STL files. Click that card in the upper right hand corner of this video, or you can find the video on this tutorials resource page on my website. Now, if you do need to convert files that have a large number of faces, then I highly recommend you check out Autodesk Mesh Mixer, which you can also download and use for free. Question number 9 is how do I change the mouse settings or how do I change my navigation settings? If you head back to your preferences dialog, you'll find a few different settings that you can change to better set up your workflow for your needs. Under the General tab, you'll see that you can reverse the zoom direction. You can check this setting if you want your mouse wheel to zoom in the opposite direction. Just above that setting is the default orbit type. The orbit tool can be accessed by holding down the Shift key and by moving your mouse around, or you can always select the orbit at the bottom of your screen. However, when you select it at the bottom, you can select a constraint orbit, which orbits the model based on a specific point, or you can select a free orbit, which means you can freely move it around. If you find yourself using one of these over the other, then you can set this preference to your desired orbit setting, which will then also be used when you use the orbit function with your keyboard and mouse. Next, you'll see above the orbit setting that you can actually set your navigation preferences based on a few other CAD packages. This can be extremely helpful if you're coming from Alias, Inventor, SolidWorks, or Tinkercad. After you apply one of these other settings, you'll find the navigation will mimic the default settings of the selected software. However, it's important to note that there are some differences in functionality between all of these CAD packages, so not everything will work 100% like the other. This is, however, a good way to bridge the gap, especially for those of you that still use another program. I'm going to leave the Preferences dialog open this time as question number 10 is also in the Preferences dialog. I often get asked, why is my Z-axis up or why is my Y-axis up? If you look at your view cube in the upper right-hand corner, you'll notice that it's probably set to the Z-axis being the vertical axis. Now, this is because the Z-axis is currently the Fusion 360 default. However, when I first started creating tutorials, the Y-axis was the default up orientation, which is why I often get asked questions on how to change this. The important thing to note with this Z versus Y orientation is that when you change this setting, it will only affect the future design files. Unfortunately, changing this setting does not change it for the files that you currently have open. However, there is a small workaround to mimic the reorientation of your model. You can reset the top and front views of your model by selecting the caret icon that shows up next to the view cube. Then you'll want to select the Set Current View As flyout folder, which lets you set the front or the top face. Therefore, if you set the front and top faces, you'll be able to reorient your model without having to rotate it using the Move command, which is extremely difficult to get it exactly right. To summarize the Y versus Z axis orientation, I also want to point out that it really doesn't have much effect on actually modeling in Fusion 360. Really, the only difference is the orientation of your model, which is often only important after you export your model for something else, such as a 3D printer slicing software. This is the reasoning for the Fusion 360 engineers to actually change the default to the Z-up orientation. They found that most of their users were 3D printing or milling parts on a CNC, which typically both use the Z-axis up, as it better represents the third dimension. If you made it to the end of this video, then let me and the rest of the community know by commenting below one of your favorite tips that you think all Fusion 360 beginners should know. I'm sure there are plenty of other helpful tips or setting changes out there, so don't be shy and share them by commenting them below, and we can all learn from each other. After dropping a comment down below, be sure to check out the resource page for this tutorial at productdesignonline.com/4. As always, I appreciate you taking the time to watch this tutorial. Please hit that thumbs up icon below if you learned something in this video. And click on that playlist in the lower right hand corner to watch my Learn Fusion 360 in 30 Days series. Lastly, to join the Product Design Online community, be sure to hit that red subscribe button and click that little bell icon to be notified of more Fusion 360 tutorials.